start. Welcome to this session, What is Feminism For? My name is Jenny Bristow, I'll be your chair for the afternoon. I'm the author of Standing Up to Super Nanny and the editor of the BPAS publication, Abortion Review. This session is being sponsored by BPAS, that's the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, and is held in association with the Birmingham Salon. So I'd like to thank the supporters of this session. I'm going to do all this quite fast because, as you can see, I've got a panel of 5 lovely ladies to discuss the question of what is feminism for in the 21st century. And I think they've got a lot to say. It's a massive issue, so I'm just going to rattle through their biographies in the order in which they are speaking and let everyone get on with it, hopefully in a non-consensual, that's the wrong word, anyway, adversarial kind of discussion, no consensus on the panel, and if there is one, I'm sure we'll find something to disagree with. So, between ourselves. Right, so first of all, we have Nina Powell, who is a PhD candidate, researcher in psychology at the University of Birmingham. Nina's also produced this session, so thanks to her for doing that. Following Nina, we'll have Cathy Young, who's contributing editor of Reason magazine and the author of Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. I bumped into Cathy last night for the first time in about 10 years, and which was when I read this book, and I can really recommend it to anyone with an interest in feminism. It's an absolutely brilliant book, published in 1999, but still very relevant today, and I'm really pleased that Cathy has come over from the States to join the panel today. Third, we'll have Anna Percy, who's a poet and freelance workshop facilitator and events organiser. So thank you, Anna. Fourth, we've got Zoe Williams. There, yeah. Columnist for The Guardian, author of Bring It On Baby, which I would recommend to anybody who's had a child, thinking of having a child, got any interest in pregnancy, because it's absolutely hilarious, and it's not your normal pregnancy advice. And finally, we've got Helen Rees, who's reader in law at the London School of Economics, and presently working on a research project to do with violence and feminism. So that's all our speakers. I'm just going to let them give their opening gambits for 2 to 3 minutes and then take the discussion from there. Nina.
So I'd like to open by saying that all of my points are predicated on a Western society. So I'm not going to be talking about the role of feminism in non-Western, underdeveloped, non-developed nations. So I just want to get that out there. So my 2 points that I'd like to address today are first about the objective reality of the progress that we've made and the objective reality about what is a perception of injustice or inequality for women, and sort of the subjective interpretation that we place on it through social movements like feminism. So first I'd like to point out just a few statistics. So we know that the objective reality is the case that 80% of women in the EU complete secondary education compared to 75% of men. We know in the objective reality that in the US, women are as likely as men to attend university and just as likely as men to complete bachelor's degrees. And in Britain, the employment rate for women is 70% and for men is 79%, and there's almost equal employment rates in the US. So I'd also like to point out that part of this is interesting because the subjective interpretation is that we've not made much progress. So oftentimes there's sort of claims about statistics such as women don't make as much money as men. It's not the case, I would assert, that women don't make as much money as men. What I mean by that is not the case that when you look gender for gender at the pay rates, yes, there is a difference and there is a gap, but it was the case that 40 years ago and longer that women on the basis of gender for the same equivalent position could make less money than a man. And we don't have that problem anymore because of things like the Equal Pay Act of 1970 in the UK and a host of other legislation that's been in place, including the Equality Act of 2010. My second point is basically that I'm concerned about gendering issues. I feel like it's important to reject biological, predetermined gender differences. And once we do that, and we decide that even if there are differences, they don't inform justice, we then need to take gender out of the equation. And my concern is that feminism today is putting gender back in the equation. We're looking at women's issues. I'm not concerned with women's issues. I'm concerned with people's issues. I'm concerned with childcare being a societal issue, not a woman's issue. I'm concerned with equal treatment is a person issue and not on the basis of gender. So I think that feminism has some contention today in that it is continually putting gender back into the argument, and I think that that is a disadvantage. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Nina. All right, well, thank you very much for letting me speak at this conference. It's a wonderful panel. I'm looking forward to what we'll have to say. I think looking at feminism and addressing the question of this panel, what is feminism for? It's really useful, I think, to look at where we were with regard to feminism, let's say, 50 years ago, or a little less than 50 years ago, when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, a sort of seminal book in launching the modern phase of the women's movement. And then a few years later, the National Organization for Women was formed in the United States, and the feminist movement also picked up in other countries. And at the time, there was a very clear set of priorities and goals and a very clear set of injustices that the women's movement addressed. There were things that were mentioned by Nina, where women were often quite formally and openly paid less than men for the same work. If you look at surveys, at least in the United States at the time, when you ask people, do you believe that women deserve to have the same opportunities in the workplace as men do, you had a very large majority, actually, saying no, they don't. Not because they hated women necessarily, but because it was felt that this was really not women's primary role in the world. That a woman's work was really something that she did before she got married, and then maybe a little bit to supplement the family income. And if she was one of those, odd women who insisted on having a career and wanted to get married and have a family, it was really her responsibility completely to balance those two, and to make sure that her husband's career was not shortchanged. There were very deeply held societal assumptions about male and female behavior. There were all sorts of formal restrictions on what women could do. There were jobs in which women were not hired. There were jobs that were reserved specifically for women, like flight attendants. And if you got married, you got fired. Or if your weight went up a little bit, then you didn't look quite as attractive as you were supposed to, you got fired. There were things like, women were not allowed into bars alone, because there was this assumption that if you were a woman alone going into a bar, you must be there to, pick up men, do something bad. So there were all these restrictions on women's behavior and women's choices. There were large universities that often did not admit women. And there was a clear set of priorities. What did feminism want? Feminism wanted to abolish all of these unjust and clearly discriminatory restrictions on women's behavior. There have been women's choices. And feminism also wanted to change these very clearly gender-based societal attitudes about what was appropriate for men and for women. There were other issues like domestic violence, where it was really a problem that never really had a name, and women did not very often have a place to go, did not have any recourse if they were battered. So I'm not going to go down the full list, but basically to make it short, there was this movement that had a very well-defined set of goals. And I think when we'll look at the situation today, we really find that it's very, very different. This is not to say that, obviously all gender disparities have been eliminated. We still have a gap in pay between men and women. But today, there are a lot of different explanations for why that gap exists. Part of the reason may have to do with lingering discrimination. I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say that it doesn't exist at all. But a lot of it also has to do with women's personal choices to, take time off for when they have children.
sometimes to conduct a part-time work, sometimes to quit altogether, maybe return a few years later, or go into a different, less high-intensity career sometimes. And all of these things have an impact on women's earnings. Now, we can discuss whether or not these choices are really freely made, which is a whole different debate, or they're the result of societal pressure and cultural attitudes that still discriminate to this day, where there's still a view that children are primarily the mother's responsibility. But this is where we get into things that are really complicated. We can't really pass a law that says, women will make the same choices about work as men do. And men will participate in childcare as much as women. I mean, we can try to pass laws that give parents the same amount of parental leave, but that still leaves the question of how do they use it. So that's sort of my point, that I think we're looking at a much more complicated set of choices, and on things like domestic violence, which we're probably going to get into a little later, we're getting into issues now, like, what about cases in which women are either the co-aggressors or perhaps even the primary aggressors? And, are we shortchanging male victims in some cases? And I think that's, it's a whole different world. I think we're looking at much, much more complicated questions that don't necessarily have easy answers.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Anna.
Okay, I'm going to start by, I'm going to be discussing advertising and fashion imagery, because fashion editorials are basically adverts in magazines. I believe that narrowed representations of both men and women in cultural products shortchange all of us. And I mean, I'm going to give a couple of examples. And I think the main thing is that you are no longer supposed to be offended by things. We are told that this isn't offensive, that they didn't mean it, that it's ironic, and that you are not allowed to complain about these things. An example I will give is there is a current advert that is running on bus stops and all over the place, and you can see it on the website, for Boost energy drinks. And the two slogans they're using are, before Boost, the only cheap thrills I got were from your sister. And the other one is, I drink Boost because it's cheap, like my girlfriend, and gives me the energy to outrun her husband. And I think both of those slogans are appalling. They are saying appalling things about women, that it's okay and normal to call women cheap, and to equate them with a cheap bottle of pop. And also that in both of those there is infidelity. And in particular, there is this thing of the sister, which is implying that he's having an affair with her sister that she doesn't know about. And there's a lot of this kind of thing, hoodwinking women, that it's okay, it's cheeky, it's fun. Like the WKD adverts, where there's all this lying to their partner business. I just think it's foul. A friend of mine wrote an email to Advertising Standards, because there was no reply from actually emailing the actual company about this. The reply was, we considered it unlikely that the ad would be perceived as demeaning to women or cause serious or widespread offence as a result. And I think that's absolutely terrible. It's a joke, you don't get it, you're a humorous feminist. And I think that you should be allowed to be angry about these things. I had a similar experience when I complained about, well, not so recent, Head and Shoulders ad now. It was one that used very obvious porn iconography. It involved a young man in a shower taking a bottle of shampoo. When he lathers up his hair, I think it was about 6 women in PVC nurses' outfits, which to me is very obviously taken from pornography, and they started lathering up his hair. They then disappear with the steam, so these women are disposable. And then at the end of the advert, the women reappear on the screen miniaturised with enormous phallic shampoo bottles, one of them jumps on it, out squirts the shampoo. And it's a money shot. They are having a money shot in a shampoo advert that is shown at all times of the day. And that is apparently acceptable. And again, I complained about this. And I didn't get any kind of real response. And I think I also posted on social media that I complained about this advert. And people went, oh, I don't understand why you're complaining. And I think, why aren't we allowed to complain about these things? And I think that there was a lot of this kind of thing in advertising and fashion editorials, and the way that women are deformed in terms with very peculiar poses and also with Photoshop. If I could just find the bit I'm referring to. Recently, a visual artist was doing a project called Poses, whereby she took poses from fashion editorials and made real women perform them in the street. And if you watch the video, the results are astonishing. There was a woman sat in a cafe, and also she's in her 40s, and naturally in her 40s, which again is something you do not see in advertising anymore. And she's got her knees drawn up, and she's sat in a chair, and she's holding a handbag in front of half of her face, and she looks completely stricken. Her face is totally blank, her mouth's wide open, and she's staring, as supposedly sexy face is nowadays. And the thing is, about 5 people come over and ask if she's okay, because she looks like she's just had a stroke. But this is the kind of imagery that we see all day, every day, on buses, on billboards, in magazines. And anybody who says, oh, advertising is a silly thing, it's something that we shouldn't be aware of. If you worked out how many times a day you see advertising, and you don't think that's affecting the way that people perceive bodies and women, I think you're wrong. And I think I've probably ranted for a very long time, so I will finish with this poem. As I mentioned, I'm a poet, and I will mention that this poem contains swearing, so if you have small children, please clap your hands over their ears now. And this is called I Don't Owe You Anything. I don't owe you a smile, I only smile when I want, not when you decree or when you comment on my body, which is not yours to comment on. I don't owe you conversation. It is not my duty to serve you, to make you comfortable in social situations. I don't owe you self-censorship. If my words offend your sensibilities, don't listen. I am owed free speech, foul words if I want. I don't owe you sex. My being kind doesn't mean I want to fuck you. I'll tell you I want to fuck you if I want to fuck you. This body doesn't owe you anything. I don't owe it to you to cover it if it offends. I don't owe it to you if you like the look of it. Your chromosomes do not imply ownership. I don't owe it to you to act as property. My being single doesn't mean I'm waiting for an IPLOS return to tag. I'm a mus because I do not want to indicate whether I'm owned or not. It's a political act, Mr. Banker.
Thank you. Okay. Zoe, they're not smiling at people. Oh, it's smiling at you.
Okay. Sorry, I've lost my voice a little bit, which makes me sound ridiculous. I'm not just putting this on Sarah's Lexi, because that would be weird. Anyway, I can agree with the question in a way, because, you know, you can't not be a feminist. It's just being a reasonable human being. So, you know, you're a feminist because you're a feminist because you're a feminist. You don't need a battle to worry with feminism. It's like saying, well, I'm a rational human being. But I suppose if there is a question, it's, are there battles that feminism should still be fighting? Are there battles that feminism should drop? And are there battles that we've won and we should be a bit more, you know, enthusiastic about? Now, obviously, we've got the vote, so that one's done, ladies. You know, we can forget about that. And there was a kind of major feature of the landscape of second wave feminism, which is about kind of objectification, which I personally, and I agree with you about advertising. And I actually complain about the Corsair advert, but I don't know that. You know, there are lots of kind of the objectification conversation, I think, ended up making a lot of people feel like it was unfeminist to flaunt your body in a sexual way, and I really don't agree with that at all. I think it's in the nature of young, beautiful people to make one another have sex with them, you know, that's what it's all about. And that's a real kind of harmony between the sexes, and I think we kind of ignore it or traduce it out of peril. But, you know, obviously there are areas which we can still fight, and the kind of, I'm not satisfied that they've been resolved, and I'm not satisfied that they can't be resolved. Philosophically, you see, and this is where I think I agree with you, even though you think you disagree with me. But I don't think that there's any point in feminism which isn't left-wing. Whenever I write that in The Guardian, they always go crazy and comment threads and go, oh right, so nobody's allowed to be a feminist if they don't agree with you. And I'm like, well, yes, that too, but also, it just isn't logical. You can't argue for parity between the genders if you don't believe in equality as a precept. And you can't argue for fairness for women and not for men, unless you believe that women are fundamentally better. Now, I know feminists who do think that, but I don't think it stands up to scrutiny. So, really, you have to kind of take it from an equality perspective and say, you know, I believe in equality between men and women for this reason, because we live in the same, and I believe in equality across the class system, because I don't think that there's any point in a society which doesn't have that as a kind of as one of its fundamentals. And to this end, I think you can defend things on whichever grounds you choose, and this is something Sylvia Baldwin is really into, is that you actually don't have to self-describe as a feminist in order to pursue a feminist cause, and you don't have to self-describe as a socialist in order to pursue an agenda of fairness. You can self-describe however you want, as long as you're pursuing a socially democratic agenda. Just for some kind of random example, I mean, it's a really good, fertile time to look for examples at which social democracy bisects feminism, because there are so many cuts and everything's so terrible and everything affects women disproportionately. But you know, you can take any example. There's a legal aid story today about obviously they're stripping 750 million out of the budget, and that will affect women disproportionately because a lot of people using legal aid are using it for domestic violence. They've just increased the stipulation for legal aid that you have to have proved that you're in danger of domestic violence in one of two ways, one of which is you've been referred to a risk assessment centre by the social services. Even that's quite difficult, it's quite advanced on all the domestic violence kind of pathway. But one of the other stipulation is that you have to have already secured a conviction. So you can only prove that you're legit, that you can get legal aid if you've secured a conviction already against your abuser, and then gone back to him, and then he started abusing you again, which just seems really, really stringent. You can look at that, right? So you could take that and say, I'm going to defend legal aid on the basis of that the legal system doesn't mean anything if not everyone has access to it, and if you can't afford access to it, then you haven't got access to it. Or you can say, you know, as a feminist, I'm going to defend it on domestic violence grounds. I don't actually care one way or the other which way you defend it, but it's got to be defended, right? Whether it's male victims or female victims, it's got to be defended. Much less obviously anti-woman measure is the removal of the childcare section of the welfare of the working family tax credit. It's really so tedious. I could see everybody like going to sleep as soon as you say working family tax credit, which I think was the point of naming it that, so that nobody would ever have to have a conversation ever again about it. Basically, as soon as you use daycare as a feminist position, then there will be feminists, and in the right mood, I would be one of them, saying, well, childcare isn't a female activity, so don't describe this as a feminist issue. Actually, of course, practically speaking, when families can't afford to go for both parties to go out to work because childcare is too expensive, it's the woman who loses her job. It's the woman who has to back out of the workforce all the time. All the time. And the idea that there are like these there might be 1 in 7 home dads, but the women who are actually forced out of work, it's always women. So it would be crazy to look at that and say, this isn't about women. Of course, it is about women. Now, the solution might not be about women. The solution might be about saying care for the under 3s is a public good. It's about workforce participation, and it's about child development. So we pay for it as a society, as we pay for schools as a society. So the solution might be feminist or not necessarily feminist, but the issue is undoubtedly kind of female-centric. There's just one other one I'm going to do, and then I'm going to... I'm going to skip that one, we can talk about that later. And just do a quick thing about reproductive rights, you know. This is really blown up recently with the Nadine Dorries amendment. It's always taken as read that, you know, when you have kids, that kind of turns you off abortion. But I've actually found since having kids, I'm much more into abortion. Not because I don't like the kids, but just because it's not until you have them and you realise what an undefended flank could represent, how completely they just explode everything in your life, that actually without rights over your own reproductive system, none of your other rights mean anything. You know, the right to vote means nothing if you can't decide when and how many children to have. The right to have your own family account means nothing. You have no freedom if you haven't got this freedom. So the more I see it, I think the problem is the anti-choice lobby has been really inoculated from the stupidity of their position by the fact that the law as it stands gives abortion on demand, as good as. So they don't have to deal with the consequences of what a country without free access to abortion would look like. But if we were in that situation, I think it would be much, much worse than anybody ever makes it sound. And I think it's an incredibly, you know, we write this off at our peril. There was a meeting last month at which, you know, we were talking about commissioning out abortion services. Basically, many doctors are no longer trained in how to do abortion, no longer trained ethically in why access to abortion is a human right. So we've got a situation in which a whole generation of GPs don't really see this as a proper, legitimate area. And if feminism has no other purpose, its purpose is to remain a bulwark against this kind of creeping squeamishness, which has really left us completely, forgetting what the point was. Anyway, I'm going to stop, but obviously I've got more to say.
Beautifully husky, thank you. Okay, Helen, thank you.
I want to start by saying that there are lots and lots of good things about feminism. Some of them have been mentioned by my fellow panellists. Just very quickly and sort of very personally, because there are so many to say here, one of the things that I think has been very exciting about feminism is that feminism, feminist theory, feminists have challenged lots of concepts, and they've given us new understandings of lots of concepts like what family is, what privacy is, what heterosexuality is. And speaking very personally, I acknowledge and owe an enormous intellectual debt in understanding those concepts in terms of my own development. So there's an awful lot that is very, very good about feminism, and I could talk about that for all my time and far beyond. But I want to turn to something that I think is very bad about feminism, particularly these days, and very, very negative. And it's kind of been touched on by the panellists, particularly Zoe, but I've got a bit of a different take on it. And what I think is very negative about feminism today is that feminism sees violence as a framework for understanding human relations, and particularly male-female relations. And by violence, I don't just mean violence, I mean those words of abuse, harassment, rape, and so on. That's seen as a framework, and I can already see some people looking puzzled, which could be good or bad. So let me just throw out a few examples of what I mean by that. So, if a colleague at work shows some sexual interest in you as a woman, you need to run that through the lens, the prism of are you being sexually harassed. If your partner is shouting at you, or even if he's being particularly grumpy in the mornings, you need to ask yourself whether this is part of a pattern of controlling behaviour, part of a pattern of power and control. Is this the start of an abusive relationship? A wolf whistle is seen as a less extreme version of what Vincent Tabak did and was found guilty of committing murder just a few days ago. They're obviously very different. I'm not saying that any feminist thinks they're the same, but they're seen as part of a continuum, a spectrum of horrible behaviour from the less extreme end of the wolf whistle to the more extreme of an atrocious murder. And actually, for a lot of feminist theorists, it's not just the wolf whistle that's part of that continuum, it's also a man holding the door open for you and behaviour like that. And the thing that really fascinates me here is, particularly speaking as a lawyer as well, is that it's always more and more. It's never less and less. So it's always a new form of rape that's been discovered that needs to be outlawed and tackled, whether it's drunken sex or pressured sex. It's always a new form of violence, so it's shouting as violence, or even argument, confrontation as a form of violence. It's always the new form of harassment that's found, whether it's sending people flowers or persistently texting them or seeing the internet. And it's never less a mess. I have never, and I really sort of throw this challenge out and I could be proved wrong, certainly as far as the law is concerned, I throw the challenge out to the audience and to my fellow panellists. I've never once seen the law say, well, you know what, actually, that's okay, that form of what we thought was harassment. Actually, that's okay. That's just a form of people being nasty to each other or annoying each other. You know what? That form of sort of unpleasant, bad sex that we did class as sexual abuse or rape, actually, you know what? That's okay. We don't need to outlaw that. It's always more and more. It's always creeping forward. And that's certainly, I think, true as far as the law is concerned. But also, from my reading of feminist theory, although, of course, you can find, a range of different positions within feminism, that's also my reading of feminist theory, sort of the new form of harassment, the new form of rape, never less. So we're peering more closely with an ever finer magnifying glass at human relations, and particularly at male-female relations, although not exclusively so. So I need to finish up. The thing that, there are lots of things that disturb me about this way of seeing human relations. But the thing that really disturbs me about this is it's just such a nasty vision of human interaction, where everybody is tainted with some form of abuse. You cannot have a relationship, certainly not a heterosexual one, that is not tainted with some form of violence or abuse. It's just simply a spectrum on that line. Everything is tainted. You almost feel like you need to go and kind of wash your hands or something, and you've been reading a lot of this stuff. So that, I think, is a really negative development within feminism today. That view of really seeing violence not as something that you find within human relations, which of course you do, but as a framework for understanding human relations.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Okay, right, there's lots there. Now what I'd like to do first of all is to see if anyone on the panel wants to challenge anyone else on the panel, but I want to just throw in two things. The first thing is for the audience. We'll have a little chat here and then we'll go out to you, but there's clearly two questions in this debate. First of all, what is the problem? And second of all is what is the solution? As I said, it's a very wide-ranging debate, but I think we should interrogate those concepts because, you know, otherwise we'll all be talking kind of cross purposes about lots of things. So, you know, is the problem men, is the solution feminism, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. And I wanted to just sort of throw at the panel something that Zoe said that I thought was quite, well, it's all interesting, Zoe, but one thing, when you said, unless I missed it, it's all right. You said you can't not be a feminist, it's just being a rational human being. Yeah. Is that true? That's the question. That's my question for the panel.
I think there's a lot of people not copying to feminism when they are feminists. An example I would use is that currently the Radio 1 DJ Reggie Yates is involved in an anti-domestic violence campaign. And I think that's very good. He seems like a nice role model and he's really outspoken about domestic violence and abuse, and I think that's a good thing. You have, and particularly if he's a young black man, I know I'm not getting to the race issue, but I think that's good. He seems like a nice chap. And this article, at the end of it, it says, I don't know whether or not I'm a feminist. And I thought, but you are one. If you are standing there in a public arena and you are discussing the issue of domestic violence, I think you are one. And I think there is a lot of this thing, I believe that some people are now thinking of feminism as a sort of dirty word. And they're not copying to it when they have, you know, they believe that women's opinion is counted the same amount, equal pay for equal time, and all of the other, you know, long-term feminist beliefs. And I just think it's really peculiar that people aren't admitted to being feminist when they are. It's being a reasonable human being.
Yeah, sure.
So I think there's some agreement amongst all of us, really. But I think the difference, for what I'm trying to say, is I think feminism is problematic. And I'm saying that because it hasn't reshaped and changed enough. And, you know, perhaps it is about a semantic argument. Perhaps it is that we just need a new word. But I think that there is some danger in glossing over issues that to me are more serious, like sort of societal problems, and making them about gender, and also constantly drawing back on this historical view that was what feminism started out as at one time. And I just want to say the reason there's some evidence for this for me is that, you know, feminism has always been in sort of the light of oppression, and it is not the case that women are oppressed anymore. It is the case that there are differences, perhaps, between the choices that men and women make, but based on legislation, based on the society that we live in today, it's not the case that a woman has an actual barrier impeding her from having this success that she wants. It is the case that we need better child care, and that is a problem. And that's a lot of the reason why women take more part-time work and perhaps take lower status jobs. So, and the other thing I just want to touch on really quick is that I think what bothers me in particular about the arguments that I hear from Anna and someone from Zoe is that feminism today for me is listening to this new etiquette, and I don't want that. It's moralizing things and problematizing things that I don't think really are that important at the end of the day. It's a sad state of affairs when we think that some of the advertising campaigns that are ridiculous and silly are actually going out and somehow driving and motivating and determining men's behaviors or even women's behaviors and thoughts. And I think for for me, this is a difference between the difference between being privately offended by something and having a public position that is political. I don't mind if you're privately offended by some of the campaigns you see in advertising and the way that it looks at women and what that represents. I do not think that that's therefore a platform for a political argument. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so
Okay, well, you're clear that feminism hasn't changed from people whose own ideas of feminism haven't changed. Feminism does reshape all the time. Feminism isn't victim feminism. What Helen is describing, I think, is kind of separatist feminism, which is different to the feminism that we all live by. We're living by quite straightforward belief in equality between the genders. I mean, that doesn't see sex as violent. There's certainly pro-sex. I mean, I'm thinking of myself as a pro-sex feminist always. In fact, I've written many features about it. Anyway, just to go back to women and their choices, this really is ridiculous. Women do have choices. As soon as they have children, their choices, they lose £565,000 over their career as a result of having children at the wrong age, right? That feeds into everything. That gives them lower status jobs in middle age and poverty in old age. It's incredibly important. It's not just, oh, you've got fine choices, maybe they're a little different. It's incredibly important, and it changes the landscape, and it changes the power balance between the genders. And you've got to, whether you say, on a non-feminist platform, I'm going to argue for childcare to be both genders' responsibility, or whether you say I'm going to do that on the basis of feminism, it still doesn't matter. But you've got to accept the situation as it stands, that just because your educational requirements might outstrip those of men, it does not mean your life will be as opportunity-filled or as good at the end of it.
okay, and any views from this side?
Yeah, well, I was going to say on the question of is it simply common sense to be a feminist, I think this is when we really get into the question of how do we define feminism. Is feminism simply about the proposition that the sexes are equal? And I think if it is, then I don't really think that there are too many people who would disagree. Is it simply the proposition that both women and men have certain fundamental human rights? There's another definition of feminism, which I think is sometimes at odds with this one, which is that feminism is about solidarity with women, a kind of class solidarity among women. And I think this is where we also get into, the word feminism is rooted in, female, in the word woman. So feminism started out as a movement for the rights of women, obviously, and I think arguably when it started out, equal rights really did mean, more rights for women in any sort of meaningful sense. There are areas today where people will argue that sometimes women are the ones who are in a more privileged position. In the United States, we don't really have it sort of in action, but we do have mandatory draft registration for men and not for women. And that is actually a legally discriminatory thing that exists. And in this case, is a feminist, or do we need some sort of other word to argue for non-discrimination, whether it affects men or women? If we talk about domestic violence, for instance, if we define being anti-domestic violence as a feminist issue, are we therefore automatically assuming that the victims of domestic violence are always women and that the perpetrators are always men? And does that mean that a feminist approach to domestic violence is female victim-centered? And there are a lot of arguments that there is, in fact, discrimination, kind of deeply entrenched discrimination against male victims of domestic violence. And you can really argue the same thing across the board on many other issues, like divorce. The rights of divorced fathers has been a pretty contentious issue. And, what is a feminist approach? There are feminists like Karen DeCrow, who was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women in the United States, who have become very active proponents of fathers' rights on the grounds of equality and on the grounds that the law should presume that mothers and fathers are equal post-divorce. There's a very powerful strand in the feminist movement in general that is very kind of vocally pro-mother. and that basically argues that women and men are not equally situated with regard to children during marriage by and large, and therefore the law really should presume that the woman is the primary parent. And that there is an argument that giving men and women equal rights after divorce, as most states in the United States have done, has actually had a kind of negative effect on women in allowing men to have sort of more negotiating power during divorce. So there's really a question there of what conceptual framework of feminism are we using? Are we talking about an equality framework, or are we talking about a rights for women framework? And the two are not always the same. And I think that's really one of the kind of bones of contention, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with a lot of that. I mean, this is one of the real difficulties with having a discussion about what feminism is for, is that, first of all, you've got to try to work out what feminism is, and it's such an incredibly amorphous word, it's just really hard to define. And the difficulty is that as soon as you say, well, feminism is bad for this reason, then up pops somebody really nice like Zoe who says, well, I don't think that, I'm not anti-sex and I'm a feminist, and has basically just absolutely proved that, you don't have to take those positions to be a feminist. But you have to sort of, and of course that's right, there are lots and lots of different types of feminists and lots of different strands, but I think you have to look back and see what feminism is doing, and where it's exerting its influence. And I absolutely refute the idea that what I'm talking about is separatist feminism or some kind of side issue within feminism. I wish that were the case. And the area that I know most about is the law. And when you look at legal changes, whether you look at the law of rape, whether you look at the law of harassment, sexual harassment, stalking, all these areas, it's absolutely the case that the law has been adapted in ways that I think is very negative, and that feminists, by which I mean mainstream feminists who are being listened to by government, it doesn't really matter which party, have their fingerprints all over those pieces of legislation. I don't want to, sort of personalise things, obviously, but if you look at somebody like Liz Kelly, who developed the idea of the continuum of violence. She's the person who got this idea going of the wolf whistle being the less extreme form of murder. You just click on her website and you'll see that she is, she's got every research grant going, she's a government advisor, she's on every committee, she's an MBE or an OBE or something like that. These are very, very mainstream feminists. So I stand back and think we have to judge feminism by the influence of it's having. Now, of course, as I said, first of all, that's not an easy thing to tally. There are lots of ways in which feminism has a very positive influence as well.
Ways, you say about the wolf whistle, but actually the most important impact feminists have had is on maternity leave and equal pay. And those are the things which were standing in the way of women having self-determination in their careers, and those are the things which have changed and revolutionised women's lives over 50 years. So, the fact that there's some nutter who doesn't like being wolf whistle is neither here nor there.
No, it's the law. It's not,
yeah, but what I'm saying is the actual statutes of legislation that have really shaped our lives have been shaped by mainstream feminists. And I would take anything, considering how low the kind of sexual harassment conviction rate is anyway, I don't think that's been anything like as influential as the mainstream career stuff.
Okay, you wanted to come back with some...
Okay, 2 points about feminism. I will refer back to 70s feminism when I think it's relevant, because things like the initial demands that were made have not been met. I would disagree with you who say that we have equal pay. There's wage gaps and there's all kinds of other wage gaps and pay gaps, like the one that you mentioned about women losing money because they have children. These are things that you cannot kind of legislate for because they're social things, they're anecdotal things. You can't necessarily, legislate for that. So that's why I refer to it, because as far as I'm aware, one of the initial demands of 1970s feminism was 24-hour free childcare, and that has not been met anywhere in the world. So
that was pretty good in Iceland.
Oh, right. Iceland seems to be pretty rude. But so I do think it's very much referred to Iceland. But also, I think that we cannot anymore discuss feminism as a kind of entity. What you have is actually feminisms, because this thing of women being a sisterhood. You know, sisterhood is powerful slogan from the 1970s. It's yeah, exactly. I was going to say really is, but there we go, you said it better. Because the thing is all women are not the same. You know, I mean, as everyone in this room is aware, that feminism split in the 70s and 80s because, you know, there was the lesbian separatist feminists that were called the Lavender Menace, there was the black feminists who had different rights and views, and there was, you know, middle-class white heterosexual feminists who all have different points of view and different aims and objectives. And I think what the point is that feminism is not one thing. We cannot define it. It is not. It is this. It is this colour. It does this. It's about your own personal views and what you were trying to achieve. And also to come back about advertising, I don't think that women are victims. I don't think that advertising, or even kind of being under the influence of advertising, makes you weak. I just think that it's so pervasive and there is so much of it constantly that it does shape the way women perceive themselves. And I also think it's a symptom of certain attitudes in society rather than it being something that creates attitudes that maybe reflect attitudes that people think are okay. So I think that's it.
Okay. I want to come back to Pierre. Is it Pierre?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're right that people won't describe themselves as a non-feminist because I think they think of it as saying I'm not anti-racism. No, I'm not anti-racist. Sorry, I'm getting my negatives mixed up. And in one way, in the sense that I mean it, it would be as bad as saying I'm not anti-racism because all I mean it to me is kind of a basic equality. But if you're, you know, as you just said, there's so many types that actually you'd be hard pushed to find somebody who agreed with absolutely every single kind of feminism. So it's telling that so few people are allowed to say they're against it. But, you know, as you said, nobody will describe themselves as a feminist either. So nobody will say they're anti-feminism, nobody will say they're a feminist. So you're actually just creating this vortex where nobody will admit to anything. And if you just say the word, everybody goes, no, I'm not one of those, but I really like them. And I think that's a kind of broader spinelessness in public debate, which, yeah, I mean, I'd love to see more of that taken up.
So I'm going to come back on 2 points. One is about advertising. I think what's problematic in this discussion is that the conflation of advertising being effective in the product choices that you make, and advertising somehow having a long-lasting impression and determinist over your behavior. And there is no evidence, psychologically, that the effect of advertising somehow shapes the roles that we have or the roles that we give to other people. I'm not saying that it can't inform them, but it's not the case that when we see things on television or whatever on the sides of buses that we, you know, are shaped by that in a way that we can't control. I mean, it's a really poor vision of how human beings have control over their own behavior. And so I think that's important to understand that when you talk about advertising and all the money that's chucked into it, so therefore it must be good. Yeah, you're right. Obviously advertising works. It's a, you know, multi-billion-dollar organization. Getting people to make snap decisions, nudge them into products, and that's the goal of it. It is not therefore okay for you to make the conclusion that that somehow shapes the human beings that we become. That's too far of a stretch. The other thing I want to say is that I do think that at the risk of sounding like I'm anti-women and anti-childcare and anti the difficulties that we are, you know, are being faced with you know, issues of reproduction, I think it's a really crass way of saying, looking at the issue by saying that women lose money because they have kids. It's not a top-down problem anymore. We don't have top-down oppression on women. I guess this is my point. This is why I don't consider myself a feminist. I think it's a bottom-up problem. It's a societal problem. And like you said, you can't legislate for women's choices. If women choose to take more part-time work because they have kids, at the same time...
What you can legislate for is state-funded jobs.
Exactly. And I completely agree with you. I think that I don't think that's a feminist woman's issue. I think that societally...
I mean, who cares? As long as women benefit.
I care. I think it does make a difference. I think it makes a difference because it's a divisive term. Feminism automatically, as Helen mentioned, in terms of, you know, violence and the way that we look at sexual aggression, it's putting gender at the forefront of people's minds.
On the one hand, you say none of the stuff is gendered, and on the other hand, you say it's a divisive term.
I think feminism is divisive and introducing and constantly reminding us of gender issues. I don't want that. That's why I think we need to take feminism out of the equation.
Kathy, Helen, quickly, please, and then there's a lot of other people.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a really quick point in response to the young women in the back who were talking about the pressures that exist today on girls. and how much has really changed. And one of the young ladies made the point that today, unlike 50 years ago, we're facing much more sort of insidious attitudes. And I think that's true, but that is also what I think makes it far more complex. Especially since a lot of those are not just men's attitudes or the attitudes of those at the top, it's the attitudes of women themselves. And I think one point that has been raised, I think what was said was, advertising all these other kind of cultural images create certain attitudes, they're problematic for men also because of how they shape men's attitudes towards women and women's attitudes towards themselves. And I think what I'm really not saying there is that, once again, we're really kind of seeing these issues as kind of negatively affecting women only and men insofar as their attitudes towards women. I mean, what about men's perceptions of themselves or women's perceptions of men? There has been a lot of research actually showing that because of advertising, because of cultural images, men are getting some of the same body issues that women have had. Not to mention the kind of pressure on men to be kind of macho and to be strong all the time, to be these kind of protectors of women. I think a lot of these issues are also issues of women's attitudes toward men and men's attitudes toward themselves. And also, just really, really quickly, in terms of things like girls being pressured to put sexy pictures of themselves on Facebook, yeah, I mean, I think that is a problem, often. I think it's really a little misguided, I think, to say that that means that nothing has really changed all that much, because that is only one facet of these girls' lives. I mean, these same girls who put sexy pictures of themselves on Facebook may also be going to law school and may be attaining more educationally than their male peers. They may be competing in sports. So I think I think women today and girls today have many more sort of facets of themselves that they're free to explore than they were, say, 50 years ago. And I think that's...
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to advertising and what Anna was saying a lot earlier on about the idea that we're not allowed to find things offensive any longer, and I would just completely disagree with that. It seems to me completely the opposite is the case, that everything is offensive these days, and we live in a very censorious climate. I mean, we're living in a climate where somebody can lose their job. We could even see, we've seen football commentators have to go because they've made a sexist remark. We could even see David Cameron fall over a sexist remark, and that becomes the debate that becomes about the remark rather than anything else. We've seen loads and loads of campaigns where, there was one example recently, the Topshop T-shirt, which it was crass. I mean, it was a pretty horrible T-shirt. Within hours, it had been withdrawn. You couldn't even find an image of it on the internet. There had been a number of complaints about it. So I just completely refute that idea that we're living in a more that we're not allowed to find things offensive any longer. I think there's more and more censoriousness about it.
It's weird that actually everybody's much more into sexualisation than they are sexism. I think that's really censorious, but it seems that they're just completely moved, and if you object to sexism, then that's really weird. But if you object to sexualisation, then that puts you in the kind of mainstream.
Well, I think that's true. I think it's both. I think it's very possible to object to sexism, and I think that really gets results. Whether you look at people losing their jobs, whether you look at items of clothing being withdrawn. I mean, sometimes it is framed around sexualisation, and that's obviously a huge debate as well, but often it is framed around this is offensive to women.
Just interestingly, before that Topshop T-shirt, Burton produced a T-shirt with a Cyrillic slogan on it which said, "Russia must be cleansed of all non-Russians." And they hadn't got a proofread because it was in Cyrillic. So they produced a T-shirt and everybody said, "This is, you're calling for people to be exterminated." So they had to halt the T-shirts. But I just bring it up as an example of actually, T-shirts are quite inflammatory.
Yeah, I think it's an example of the crisis of language simplicity will go from Anna to Helen.
Okay, I discussed advertising because my background is in cultural studies, that was my undergrad, and I saw it as something that I could discuss that I knew well. I have also done events for Women International, who are a wonderful charity who help support women who are affected by war. So can't look into that. But I think feminism for me is a place that questions. It questions ideas of gender, and for men and women, because I think men's roles are very poorly painted in cultural representations of men. There is 1 in 7 men is now a stay-at-home dad. They're almost invisible on telly. You don't see them, and they are there. And I was raised by 2 different stay-at-home dads at different points in my life. So what I'm saying is feminism for me is for men, for women, for everyone of every race, sexuality, gender, everything. And also trans rights are a very important area right now. So what I'm trying to say is that feminism is a framework that questions the status quo and how things work, and that is why it's important to me.
We'll have more at the end, like really, really loudly. Yeah. I don't need that. So I can see quite a lot of points from Anne to Martha, certainly. The developing world, I just, it obviously is a massive problem. It's a completely different conversation. You can't say, because things are worse in the developing world, we stop having the conversations. That would be like saying, because Saudi Arabian women, because in Saudi Arabia there's no equality, then we shouldn't have a conversation about pay gaps. I mean, you've still got to deal with democracy in your own country. It's just ridiculous. Basically, like this point you make about feminism coming out of the fact that the Labour Party weren't doing enough, I think is fascinating, because I think a new left is going to come out of the fact that the Labour Party isn't being left enough. And I agree with Martha that actually that is the future of feminism. Really, as I said at the beginning, I think these issues are indivisible. I don't think you can argue for fairness on one point without arguing from another. And if feminism is to have a relevance, I don't think that relevance is going to come from finally thrashing to death what we all mean by it. It's by saying, if we have these precepts, are they being represented in mainstream booklets, and if not, how are we going to represent ourselves? So I'm considering abandoning feminism altogether and just going from Marxist.
So I think in response to Anne's question or point, how do we define feminism? To me, how I define feminism, I think that feminism was a very important movement. I don't want to belittle what feminism did for women and for equality in the 70s and even before that and even somewhat after that. I'm talking about how we achieve social justice on issues that I think are more nuanced than just having blanket terms about differences that are women's issues or women's differences or men's issues and men's differences. And I'll give you just a couple of examples to leave you with, so hopefully you understand what I mean. One is childcare. It's come up several times. Childcare should be something that we have, 24-hour childcare, access to it. It's not a woman's issue. It's just not a woman's issue anymore. The other thing is parenting. Attitudes towards parenting obviously guide a lot of the choices. The bottom-up sort of gap that we see now in terms of women's equality in the workplace, which is, again, as Kathy pointed out, a lot to do with choices that women make, but a lot of that is dictated by how we make women and men feel about their role as parents. And a lot of that stuff is coming from absolute nonsense in terms of science, telling us that the first 3 years of our lives matter more than anything, that actually parenting is going to dictate the person you become as an adult, and that kind of crap is not a woman's issue, again, and just a slightly different, quickly, I just want to, finish on the point that I don't think we need to talk about gender anymore. I don't think it's an issue. I think we need to have debates about sort of social problems, human problems, and I think that it's important. The reason I have a problem with feminism, I guess on the whole, is because it's always denying the progress. I feel like there's just so much denial. There's statistics about women's pay gaps now that don't include, taking into account the experience of the woman, the skill, their occupation, their education, the number of hours they work. It's just a blanket statement that I hear thrown out. Women and men don't have equal pay. It's just not the case. It's not what it was 40 years ago. I think we need to have a more honest feminism if we're going to have it at all.
Okay, thank you. Kathy?
Well, I think in terms of defining feminism, if we're talking about defining what I consider to be feminism in a positive sense, to me it really does mean a fair deal for women. It means actually not just a fair deal for women, but a fair deal for everyone regardless of gender. And to me it also means treating people as individuals first and foremost. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain gender differences that may have a biological component. That still means you approach an individual as an individual, since individual differences in any case are going to supersede whatever group differences you find between the genders. Just very quickly touching on some of the things that were raised in terms of taking offense to sexist humor. there is a lot of sexist humor against men. And, you know, the feminists have made some really, really male-bashing jokes that I sometimes find offensive too, you know. There are a lot of, speaking of advertising, I don't know about here, but in the United States, there's a very kind of entrenched pattern of TV commercials in which the man is the idiot and the woman is the sort of wise, all-knowing person who, you know, is much more competent and just really better in every way. Childcare. I think that's a really, really legitimate issue. I do think that questions like subsidized childcare also bring up, you know, things that we're facing today, like the economic crisis. You know, how much of a welfare state can we afford? I don't think we can look at it in the abstract. But also, I think that to say that childcare, you know, because women are in the workforce, therefore childcare should be a public responsibility. I think that really, in a way, really takes men off the hook, so to speak, and it really presumes that there is no possibility of negotiating a different division of parenting, a more kind of balanced division of parenting between men and women. And I think to give up on that is really a little too pessimistic, actually. And finally, really quickly, on the whole issue of women in different cultures and, you know, in different societies, I do think that that's a very real concern, whether we're talking about immigrant communities in the West or countries in the third world. And I don't think that, you know, expressing concern over the status of women in, you know, whether it's the Congo or Saudi Arabia, I don't think that automatically equals intervention and, you know, going in there. And nobody's talking about going in there with, you know, fighter planes and tanks or whatever. I mean, I think to express concern over that and, you know, to give support. I mean, I don't think that women in many of those countries really have the resources in them to deal with this sort of oppressive machine that they're facing. So I think to abdicate that, I think would be a real mistake out of, you know, deference to cultural independence or, you know, whatever. I think there's a real kind of tension between multiculturalism and feminism sometimes, and I think that's something that needs to be looked at honestly. Not all cultural traditions are equal when it comes to dealing with women. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Helen.
What is feminism? Well, Janet Halley boiled it right down to the core in a book a few years ago where she says it's carrying a brief for women. And in other words, what she's saying there is that feminism in its real essence is if it's good for women, then it's good. And I think when you boil it right down to its essence like that, I think it is problematic for lots and lots of reasons, which I'm not going to go into, obviously, all of them. But perhaps most importantly, because as we've seen in this discussion, it's not obvious what's good for women. There are a lot of different views on that, on, you know, any issue that you choose to mention. And that's why really my experience of feminism in the areas that I work in is that feminism makes it seem obvious. It makes it seem obvious what is good for women. So there's a feminist line on rape, there's a feminist view on abuse, which you depart from at your peril. And that's why my experience of feminism in the areas that I work in is that it's censorious, it's often prissy, and it functions to close down, not open up debate, but luckily not here.
Thank you.